And no one moves a limb, a muscle when Camilla passes. And that was because they were angry with Camilla, and they were furious. And not only that, Kate and William were angry too. And that anger, of course, Harry was angry. That anger went right through that small part of the congregation.
Francis has always been known for caring about family, but nothing beats the crazy step he took against Queen Camilla. Inside the palace, someone gave him some private papers, and what he read totally shocked him. Camilla had taken Prince Louis and Princess Charlotte out of his will. What happened next ended with her getting kicked out in a way nobody ever expected. So stick with us as we share the whole story of what went down. Inside the palace, the morning sun shone softly through the big windows of Buckingham Palace, and King Charles sat in a private office, surrounded by paintings of kings and queens who ruled before him. Their painted eyes seemed to watch him with a serious look. But Charles stared at two paintings in particular. One was Queen Victoria, whose time as queen shaped a whole era, and the other was his grandmother, Queen Mary, who was known for always sticking to tradition. As he looked at their faces really carefully, he saw something weird on his desk. It was a sealed envelope that was cream-colored and only had an official wax seal on it. And someone had delivered it to him that morning. Charles looked at it with curiosity, but also felt a little nervous, because envelopes like this usually had important stuff inside. He didn't know yet that inside it were words that would spark anger, betrayal, and a scandal big enough to shake the royal family itself. Keep watching to find out what happened next. He reached for the envelope slowly, his hands looking steady on the outside, but anxious on the inside. The wax seal cracked as he broke it, and the paper slid out into his hand. The paper was thick, smooth, and official, the kind used only for really serious stuff. As he opened it up, his eyes immediately landed on the title, which said, "Changes to the Last Will and Testament of His Majesty, King Charles III." Charles blinked, his breathing stopping for a second. Changes. He hadn't asked for any changes. His eyes moved faster now, reading the page line by line, and then he froze. His heart started racing. Two names he loved most in the world were missing: Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis. The spot where their names should have been was gone, completely erased. Right then, his heart started pounding harder. He read the words again, once, twice, even 3 times, hoping the letters would change into something else. But they didn't. The truth stayed harsh and cold on the page. The document said clearly that his grandkids, Charlotte and Louis, wouldn't be direct heirs in his will anymore. A slow and creepy wave of shock came over him, and his fingers trembled a little as he kept reading down the page. Then his eyes drifted down to the signature line. And there, in clean black ink, he found words that weren't his. What he saw was a handwritten note to the royal lawyers. And it was short but meant something that couldn't be misunderstood. The note said, "Go ahead with this change like we talked about." And the final mark of the pen left no doubt. The handwriting was immediately familiar. It had the same style and flow he'd seen many times before. It was Camilla's, clear and obvious. And realizing this hit him like a punch of betrayal. For a moment, he couldn't think straight. He could only feel the sting of being backstabbed. He looked up at the painting of Queen Mary on the wall. Her serious face seemed even more intense now, like she was watching him with disappointment. He thought of Queen Victoria, who had ruled with so much strength. And he wondered what she would have thought about this. Would she have let her legacy get changed in secret? Would she have forgiven such bold meddling? As anger built up inside him, another thought cut even deeper. This wasn't just about inheritance or money. It was about kids, innocent kids. Charlotte, who had sat on his lap once, asking tons of questions about the jewels in the crown. Louis, who had run to him with his arms wide open, laughing without a worry in the world. What could they possibly have done to deserve this? To have their names erased like they had no place in his legacy. The thought made his jaw clench. But then, as his anger got stronger, a memory came back to him. He remembered little comments Camilla had made before, ones he'd brushed off at the time. It was a rainy afternoon months ago when they'd been sitting in his office with the fire crackling. She had talked lightly, almost like she was just making small talk. "It might be smart to make things simpler, Charles," she said. "Too many people weaken the system." He had looked at her then with only mild interest. He thought she meant cutting unnecessary spending, trimming down ceremonies, and reducing costs. He dismissed it with a nod, promising to think about it later, but never did. Another time at dinner, she had said again, "William's kids will always be taken care of. Some of them will get titles and estates. Maybe not all need the same amount." He remembered frowning a bit. But he let it go because he was tired and didn't want to argue. Now those casual remarks were right in front of him in real life, shown in the paper he held. They weren't harmless comments anymore. They'd been seeds planted carefully, quietly, and now they'd grown into something much darker. The silence in the room pressed down on him harder, and he whispered to himself, "Why?" The answer didn't come. Only the clock kept ticking, counting down seconds that felt incredibly heavy. Charles sat back down in his chair. The paper lay spread out on the table in front of him. His fingers pressed across it like by holding it down he could somehow stop the truth from getting out. But the betrayal was real and burning. It wasn't just what she did, but the sneakiness that made it worse to know that Camilla had gone straight to the legal office without him knowing, without his permission. It was more than being cocky. It was rewriting history. Camilla's mind, however, saw things differently. In recent months, she'd been reading about queens who had influenced kings from behind the scenes. Women who were remembered not just as wives, but as builders of dynasties. She admired those who had acted boldly when the crown seemed in danger. She started to see herself in that line of powerful women, the kind who shaped the future with a firm hand. In her eyes, this change wasn't betrayal. It was protection. She believed the royal family faced uncertain times and that focusing resources would make it stronger. But Charles couldn't see it that way. To him, it wasn't about being practical. It was about love, family, and honor. Removing Charlotte and Louis wasn't streamlining. It was erasing them. It wasn't wisdom. It was cruelty. He stood up again, walking back and forth across the office, his robe dragging slightly behind him. His eyes looked again at the painting of Queen Mary, whose stare stayed serious and unforgiving. He felt her presence like a weight on his shoulders, like she was pushing him not to let this slide. The betrayal burned deeper now, because this wasn't done by an enemy, but by his wife. The woman who was supposed to share his burden. She had crossed a line that couldn't be fixed with nice words. He felt anger like he hadn't felt in years, a fire that was both royal and personal. Finally, he rang the small bell on his desk. A servant came in quietly, bowing, waiting for orders. Charles's voice was calm, but had a steel edge. "Bring Queen Camilla to me." The servant nodded and left the room, leaving Charles alone again with the heavy envelope on the table. He stood there staring down at it, his fists clenching at his sides. He knew this wasn't going to be a gentle conversation. It was going to be a showdown, because at its core, this was more than a disagreement. This was a battle between two different ideas of what the crown should be. For Charles, history was something that had to be respected. For Camilla, history was a tool that could be shaped to ensure survival. These two views were about to crash into each other. The golden quiet of that morning had been destroyed. What had started with sunlight streaming softly through palace windows was about to blow up into a storm. A storm that wouldn't just test their marriage, but also shake the very idea of what it meant to be royal. So stay tuned as we dive into what happened when Camilla finally walked into that room, when Camilla walked into the room slowly. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who thought she'd done nothing wrong. She was dressed in a dark outfit that gave her a look of power, and her steps were steady, almost practiced. Like she'd prepared for this moment long before it came. Charles was already waiting for her, and he stood near the tall windows, his back straight and his hands clasped behind him. The golden light of late afternoon stretched across the room, but the warmth of it did nothing to soften the cold silence hanging between them. He looked at her, not with the eyes of a husband, but with the eyes of a man who'd been betrayed. His face was firm and his jaw was tight. And even though he wanted to hear her explanation, he already feared what her answer would be. When he finally asked if she'd really tried to cut Prince Louis and Princess Charlotte out of the will, Camilla didn't hesitate. She admitted it, and she did so calmly, almost like she believed her reasons would clear her of any blame. Her voice was steady and had no hint of sorry in it. Instead, she started to talk with the tone of someone giving a lesson. Like this wasn't personal, but part of a bigger truth. She explained that she'd acted out of duty, not meanness, and she used history to defend herself. She talked about past queens who'd faced tough times and who'd made decisions that were painful but necessary. She mentioned Queen Mary and reminded Charles how she'd protected the line of succession during chaotic times. Camilla claimed that strong queens had always been willing to make hard choices, and she believed she was following in that same tradition. According to her, the royal family couldn't afford to be softened by feelings because feelings had a way of weakening its very foundation. She argued that the crown had survived for centuries because rulers put duty before personal emotions. And as she talked, she made it clear that she thought Charles was too gentle and too emotional to do what was needed. In her eyes, she wasn't betraying him, but protecting the crown. For a few moments, her words seemed to hang in the room like a heavy curtain. Charles listened closely, and he couldn't deny that history was full of stories of rulers who'd chosen duty over love. But the more she talked, the more his heart twisted. He felt like she was using history not as a guide, but as a weapon. And when he finally spoke, his voice was sharp with both sadness and anger. Yes, history remembers those queens, Charles said, his voice low but cutting. But it also remembers the times they lived in. That was an age when kings and queens ruled with total power, and survival often meant making sacrifices. We don't live in that world anymore. Camilla didn't reply right away. She stood with her hands folded in front of her, her face unchanged. But Charles kept going because he couldn't hold back the storm inside him. He told her that the royal family survived today, not through fear or ruthless choices, but through trust and unity. And he reminded her that they weren't rulers who acted alone anymore. They were symbols who represented the people, and they were judged not just by history, but by the eyes of the world. And then he hit the wound that cut deepest. He told her that those queens she admired had acted alongside their kings, not against them. And even when their choices were hard, they weren't done in secret. Camilla hadn't talked to him, and she hadn't given him a chance to speak as the king. Instead, she'd made the decision on her own, and she'd done it behind his back. To Charles, this wasn't duty. It was betrayal. He turned his face toward the gardens outside, trying to calm himself down. But the falling autumn leaves gave him no comfort. Watching them gently fall only made the storm in his chest feel louder. He'd spent his whole life learning how to carry the weight of the crown, and he'd always believed that the people closest to him would never undermine that burden. But now, the one person he trusted most had gone behind him, and the betrayal felt almost unbearable. Camilla held her ground. She believed Charles was blinded by love for his grandchildren, and she believed his affection would lead the royal family into weakness in her mind. She'd done what was necessary, and she didn't let his words change her mind. She said quietly, "You're thinking like a grandfather, not like a king. Her words hurt him more deeply than she could have imagined, because they reduced his love for Louis and Charlotte to nothing more than emotion. For Charles, that love wasn't weakness. It was humanity, and humanity was what kept the royal family alive. In a world that no longer bowed to crowns and thrones, the argument wasn't about the will anymore. It had grown into something way bigger. It was now about what their roles meant, about the limits of power, and about the very soul of the royal family they represented. Charles felt like she'd confused ambition with duty, and she'd confused sneakiness with strength. His voice got louder, and the calmness that had held him back until now shattered. "You didn't act like a queen who supports her king," he said fiercely. "You acted like a wife who thought she could rule in his place." Camilla didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed steady, but her silence spoke louder than words. Charles saw that her silence wasn't about feeling sorry. It was defiance, and that only made his anger worse. The air in the room got heavier, and the walls seemed to close in as the fight reached its peak. For Charles, this was the breaking point. He realized this wasn't a misunderstanding that could be forgiven. It was a choice she'd made with clear purpose. And it was a choice that had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. His voice was louder now, and it carried both pain and finality. "You have betrayed me," he declared, "and you have betrayed this family. What you've done can't be forgiven, and I won't let you stay by my side." The silence that followed was crushing. Camilla didn't argue, and she didn't beg. She stood firm in her belief, but she also knew that her conviction had cost her everything. Charles had drawn the line, and he'd done it with no way back. When she finally turned and walked away, her steps were as steady as they'd been when she arrived. But the weight of her decision hung in the air like a shadow that would never lift. Charles stayed by the window. And even though the autumn garden was still beautiful, it no longer brought him peace. He was left standing alone, a king with a crown on his head, but a man who'd just lost the one he'd once trusted most. The room was silent, but the echoes of their fight would linger for way longer than the fading light of that day. But here's the most interesting part. Camilla's exit from the palace wasn't dramatic, and it had no ceremony or goodbye. She left quietly, and the silence that followed her footsteps seemed to echo louder than any sound. Charles didn't call the royal advisors, and there was no official announcement made. It was simply the end of her presence at the heart of the royal household. She walked out with her head held high, not in shame, but with a kind of pride, because in her own mind, she believed she'd done what history demanded of her. She thought of herself as a woman who'd tried to carry the burden of the royal family in ways others couldn't understand as the doors closed behind her. She told herself that time would eventually prove her right. She thought of Queen Margaret of Anjou, the powerful wife of Henry VI, who'd been painted by history as ambitious and overreaching, but who'd fought hard to protect her crown. Camilla saw in that story a reflection of herself, and she imagined that she too was being punished. Not because she was wrong, but because she was strong in a world that resisted women who held power. But while she left with that thought, the palace itself was gripped by a different silence. Charles stood in his private office, still holding the documents that had revealed the betrayal. And though he'd made his decision firmly, the weight of it pressed heavily on him. He knew the world outside those walls would soon know what had happened. And he also knew that once the news got out, it wouldn't belong to him anymore. It would belong to the press, to the commentators, and to the countless voices eager to shape the story into whatever version suited them best. It didn't take long. Within days, whispers started reaching the newspapers, and the headlines soon followed. The press didn't have the full truth, but they had just enough to create their stories. Some papers reported the story like it was nothing more than a family fight, suggesting that Camilla had disagreed with Charles over inheritance stuff and that the king had reacted strongly. Other outlets, however, hinted at something deeper. They talked about a queen consort who'd tried to reshape a king's will and who'd been banished from his side as a result, and a few, probably with sources friendly to Camilla, drew comparisons with history itself, subtly weaving in references to queens who dared to challenge kings. Palace fight over king's will, one headline said. Another asked, has Queen Camilla gone too far? The guessing grew each day, and the royal family found themselves once again at the center of a storm. For Charles, the storm was personal, but for the royal family, it was political. The people had always watched the royals closely, but moments of scandal drew attention with even more intensity. Every word in the papers was studied. Every photo was examined for hidden meaning, and every action by Charles or William was seen as a signal of where the royal family stood. William soon came to see his father, and when Charles put the documents in his hands, the weight of them was obvious. William read them carefully, and as his eyes moved over the lines where Louis and Charlotte's names had been removed, his face hardened. He listened as Charles explained Camilla's defense, how she'd used history and compared herself to queens who'd made difficult choices. William was furious, not just at what she did, but at the arrogance behind it. He saw no nobility in Camilla's reasoning, only an attempt to use history as a cover for something petty and destructive. To him, comparing herself to the great queens of the past wasn't an act of wisdom, but one of vanity. He told his father that such actions, if left unchallenged, would set an example that could never be undone. She wanted to erase them. Father, William said firmly. And if she could do this in secret once, what would stop her from trying again? This isn't duty. This is ambition. Charles nodded. He'd already known this, but hearing it in William's voice gave it more weight. In that moment, father and son stood united, not just against Camilla's action, but in their determination to protect the royal family from further harm. They both understood that the institution survived not because of ruthless calculations, but because of the trust it represented. And at the center of that trust were the children, the heirs of the future, whose security couldn't be sacrificed for the ambitions of one consort. As the media storm grew, Camilla's supporters whispered her version of events into the ears of friendly journalists. They painted her not as a betrayer, but as a woman misunderstood, a consort who'd been punished for trying to act in the royal family's best interest. Some of the commentary compared her to powerful women from the past. And though those comparisons gave her some comfort, they also deepened the split between her and the royal household. Charles, however, wouldn't bend. When the time came for their final meeting, there was no hope of making up left. Camilla tried one last time to reach him, and she spoke not with the calm authority of history, but with the softer tone of their shared past. She reminded him of the years they'd spent together, the struggles they'd gone through to be accepted, and the devotion she'd given him through it all. She appealed to him not as a queen consort, but as the woman who'd once been his closest companion. Charles listened, and for a moment his heart wavered, but he knew the truth couldn't be ignored. He told her that he respected her ambition, but ambition alone didn't make her actions right. He explained that by cutting Louis and Charlotte from the will. She hadn't just acted in secret, but had also tried to change the very heart of the royal family. He said quietly, "You chose the wrong path, and the crown can't walk with you anymore." Those words ended what little hope remained. Camilla left, knowing that she'd lost not just her place beside him, but also her role in the future of the royal family. She'd once believed that history would prove her right, but now she faced the reality that history might remember her only for this moment of betrayal. Charles, meanwhile, turned his focus to the future. He and William started to work side by side, and together they showed a united front. The world soon saw them with Prince Louis and Princess Charlotte walking together in public, smiling and talking to crowds, making it clear that the kids were loved and secure. The photos of those appearances spoke louder than any words. And they sent a message that the royal family was strong, not because of cold, calculated decisions, but because of family and unity. Behind palace walls, Charles thought often about the paintings that lined his private rooms. He looked at the faces of Queen Victoria and Queen Mary, and he thought about the choices they'd made in their own times. He also understood that he lived in a different world, one where the survival of the royal family depended less on ruthless decisions and more on compassion and integrity. He'd chosen to stand by his grandchildren. And in doing so, he believed he'd chosen the right path. He told himself that the royal family couldn't be left to the political games of a consort, no matter how well-meaning the consort believed herself to be. It had to stay anchored in the authority of the king, guided by love for family and by loyalty to the people it served. That was the legacy he wanted to leave behind. And that was the example he hoped William would carry forward. So, do you think King Charles was right to banish Camilla after discovering her attempt to change the will? Or do you believe history will judge her differently, maybe even proving her actions were right one day? Drop it in the comment section below. If you enjoyed watching this video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more. Also, click the next video shown on your screen.